For a long time, I actually felt guilty even thinking about sharing it because at the center of this story is someone I cared about for years, my friend Emily. We met when we were 19 during our first year at university in Manchester. She was funny, easy to talk to, and somehow always made people feel comfortable around her. But there was something about Emily that I only understood much later. She was incredibly good at making excuses for people, especially for the people she loved. At first, I thought that was just because she had a kind heart. I thought she was the type of person who always wanted to see the best in others. But after watching everything that happened over the next few years, I realized it wasn't only kindness. A lot of it came from the way she had grown up. Emily's family looked normal from the outside. Her parents were together. They had a nice house outside Manchester. Her father had a stable job. Her mother was always involved in everything she did. But inside that house, things were much more complicated. Her father was the kind of person who believed that because he provided for her, he had the right to control every part of her life. Even when Emily turned 18, nothing really changed. He still checked where she was going. He still wanted to know who she was meeting. There were times when he would take her phone away because he didn't like how much time she spent talking to friends. I remember one night when we were supposed to go out for dinner after class. Emily suddenly texted me saying she couldn't come. I asked her what happened. She replied, "My dad said, I don't need to be outside tonight." I remember staring at that message because she was already 18. She wasn't a child, but she wrote it like it was completely normal. When I asked her why she didn't just tell him she was going, she laughed and said, "You don't know my dad. It's easier this way." At the time, I didn't understand how much that sentence explained about her. Because when someone grows up believing that love always comes with rules, sometimes they don't recognize control when it appears in a different form. And that was exactly what happened when she met Ethan. Ethan was 21 when they started dating. They met through mutual friends at a small gathering in Leeds. Emily told me about him the next morning. She was smiling the entire time. She said, "He's different." I remember laughing and asking, "Different how?" And she said, "He actually listens." That was the thing that made her fall for him. She just felt like someone finally cared about what she had to say. At the beginning, Ethan really did seem like a good person. He remembered small details about her life. He would call her after difficult days. When Emily talked about her father, Ethan would tell her, "You shouldn't have to feel like you're asking permission to exist." And honestly, I understood why she loved him. Because after years of feeling controlled at home, Ethan felt like freedom. For the first year, everything seemed perfect. They spent every weekend together. They talked about traveling. They talked about moving in together someday. Emily was happier than I had seen her in years. But slowly, things started changing. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing happened overnight. It was small things. Things that are easy to ignore when you love someone. Ethan started asking why she didn't reply immediately. At first, it seemed harmless. He would say, "I was just worried." Then it became, "Why were you online but didn't answer me?" Then, "Who are you talking to?" Emily always explained it away. "He just cares. He misses me. He's just insecure." And maybe some of those things were true. But the problem was that every time he felt uncomfortable, Emily was the one changing something about herself to make him feel better. She stopped posting certain pictures. She started thinking twice before making plans with friends. She would check her phone constantly because she didn't want him to think she was ignoring him. I noticed it before she did. One evening, we were sitting in a coffee shop near campus, and she was checking her phone every few minutes. I asked, "Are you waiting for Ethan?" She smiled awkwardly. "He gets anxious when I disappear." I looked at her. "Emily, you were gone for 40 minutes because we were getting coffee. She laughed. I know. It sounds stupid. And then she immediately defended him. He's just scared of losing me. That was the moment I started worrying because I had heard that sentence before. People often say someone is scared of losing them, but sometimes what they really mean is someone is scared of not controlling them anymore. A year later, Emily got an incredible opportunity. She was accepted into a university program in Ireland. It was something she had worked toward for years. She got into a respected university in Dublin to study international relations. When she received the acceptance email, she called me immediately. She was crying while laughing. She kept saying, I actually did it. For the first time, I saw her completely focused on herself, not on her parents, not on Ethan, just herself. But then reality hit. She and Ethan had to figure out what this meant for their relationship. The distance between Manchester and Dublin wasn't impossible. People travel that distance all the time. He could have moved. He could have looked for opportunities there. He even had a background in architecture and enough experience to try. But Ethan convinced himself he couldn't do it. He said he wouldn't find work. He said he would fail. He told Emily, You're moving forward and I'm going to be stuck behind. And instead of asking him to meet her halfway, Emily started feeling guilty. She told me, I don't want him to feel abandoned. I remember thinking, but who is making the sacrifice? Because Emily was the one leaving everything familiar behind. She was the one starting over. Yet, somehow, she was still the person apologizing. Eventually, she moved to Dublin. The first few months were difficult. She missed home. She missed Ethan. She missed having someone familiar around. And because of that, she tried even harder. Whenever she had a free weekend, she would visit him, even when she was exhausted, even when flights were expensive. She wanted to prove that the distance didn't change anything. But while Emily was trying to hold the relationship together, something strange started happening. Ethan became more suspicious. The person who had once told her she deserved freedom was now questioning every little thing she did. If she went out with classmates, he wanted to know who would be there. If she posted a picture, he would ask who had taken it. If she dressed differently, he would comment on it. One evening, she called me after talking to him. She had been getting ready for a university event. She had done her hair and makeup. Nothing unusual. Just something she wanted to do because she was finally feeling confident in a new country. During the video call, Ethan immediately asked, Where are you going? She laughed and said, I told you, I'm going to the event. Then he replied, Why are you dressed like that? And suddenly, her whole mood changed. She spent the next 20 minutes explaining herself to her boyfriend about wearing makeup. I remember thinking, how did she not see how unfair this was? But then I remembered Emily's whole life. She had spent years explaining herself to her father. Maybe Ethan didn't feel completely different. Maybe he just felt familiar. And sometimes familiar things are the hardest ones to recognize. I didn't know it yet, but that year in Dublin would change everything. Because after months of defending Ethan, after months of believing they could fix everything, Emily was about to discover something that would make her question the entire relationship. One night, she called me. She said, I think I found something on his phone. And the way she said it told me immediately that whatever she had seen was something she couldn't ignore anymore. That was the first time I heard doubt in her voice. Not about whether she loved him, but about whether she actually knew him. When Emily told me she found something on Ethan's phone, I honestly expected the worst. Not because I thought he was a terrible person, but because I had watched small things build up for months. I remember sitting on my bed that night, holding my phone, waiting for her to explain. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she finally said, I wasn't trying to check his phone. And that sentence immediately told me she felt guilty, like she had done something wrong. I asked her what happened. She explained that Ethan had been visiting her in Dublin that week. They had been trying to make the distance work, and she was excited because she thought maybe things were finally getting better. That weekend had actually felt normal again. They went around the city, they had dinner together, they talked about their future. Emily told me she remembered thinking, maybe we're finally past the difficult part. But on the last night before he went back to Manchester, something happened. They were sitting in her apartment. Ethan was in the kitchen making coffee, and his phone was charging on the table. A notification appeared. Emily said she didn't even mean to look. It was just there. A message from one of his friends. And the preview showed something that immediately caught her attention. It was about another girl. At first, Emily thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just a joke. Maybe she was reading it the wrong way. But then she opened the conversation. And what she saw hurt her. It wasn't that Ethan had physically cheated on her. It was something that was harder to explain. He had been talking with his friends about other girls, comparing them, discussing who they thought was attractive, sending pictures of girls they knew, making comments that Emily felt were disrespectful. And the worst part was that Ethan wasn't acting like someone who was uncomfortable with the conversation. He was participating. Emily told me she sat there for almost 10 minutes just scrolling, not because she wanted to find more, because she was trying to understand what she was looking at. This was the same person who had spent months telling her that he was worried about losing her, the same person who questioned what she wore and who she talked to. And now she was seeing that while he was asking her to prove her loyalty, he was behaving in a way that broke her trust. When she confronted him, he immediately apologized. He said it was stupid. He said it meant nothing. He said, "All guys talk like that." And that sentence made Emily even more upset because she wasn't angry only because of the messages. She was angry because he didn't seem to understand why it hurt. She called me crying. She said, "Am I overreacting?" And I remember feeling so frustrated because Emily had spent months questioning herself every time he made her uncomfortable. I told her, "No, you're allowed to feel hurt." That night, she ended things with him, or at least she tried to. She told him she needed space. She told him she didn't know if she could trust him anymore. For a few days, she actually seemed different. She started focusing on university again. She spent more time with people from her course. She was slowly becoming the version of herself I remembered before Ethan. But then he started trying to win her back. And I understood why she struggled. Because Ethan wasn't only the person who hurt her. He was also the person who had been there during some of the hardest years of her life. That's what makes these situations complicated. People are not just the bad moments. Someone can make you feel loved and still hurt you. Someone can support you in one way and damage you in another. Ethan called her every day. He sent long messages. He told her he finally understood what he had done. He promised he would change. And eventually, Emily believed him. I remember when she told me they were trying again. I wasn't going to tell her what decision to make. But I did tell her one thing. I said, "If you forgive him, don't forgive him because you're scared to lose him. Forgive him only if you truly believe things can be different." She promised me she understood. For a while, things looked better. And maybe that was the hardest part. Because when someone hurts you and then becomes nice again, it becomes easy to believe the problem is gone. A few months later, Emily finished her first year in Dublin. She was doing well. She made friends. She became more independent. But the relationship started becoming more difficult again. The difference was that now Ethan wasn't only insecure, he was becoming controlling. He didn't like that Emily had a life outside of him. He didn't like that people around her were encouraging her to be more confident, especially because some of those people were men. Emily had two cousins living nearby in Ireland. They were family. They were the people she called when she felt lonely. But Ethan started questioning even that. He would ask, "Why are you always with them?" "They're your cousins." "I know, but I just don't like it." At first, Emily laughed because it sounded ridiculous. But then she realized he was serious. And slowly, she started changing her behavior again. The same pattern. She would adjust her life to prevent his reactions. One evening, she told me something that stayed with me. She said, "I feel like I'm always trying to avoid making him upset." And I remember thinking, that is not what love is supposed to feel like. But Emily still defended him. She said, "He's just scared. He loves me." And maybe he did love her, but love without trust becomes exhausting. Love without respect becomes painful. The strange thing was that while Ethan was becoming more controlling, he was also doing things that made Emily question him even more. There were moments when he disappeared for hours, and whenever Emily asked where he was, he would get annoyed. He would say, "Why are you interrogating me?" The same person who wanted constant updates from her suddenly hated being questioned himself. Then one day, Emily found out something else. A friend of hers mentioned seeing Ethan around Manchester with another girl. At first, Emily didn't believe it because Ethan had told her he was spending the day with his friends. But then she found out it was true. He had been driving another girl home, talking with her, spending time with her, someone Emily actually knew. And suddenly, all those months of him accusing her of things felt completely different because the person who had been making her prove she was trustworthy was the person who kept creating reasons for her not to trust him. That night, Emily called me again, but this time, she didn't ask me if she was overreacting. She just said, "I think I finally understand." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I spent so much time trying to convince him I wasn't going to leave him that I forgot to ask myself why I was staying." That was the first time I felt like she was finally seeing the situation clearly. But there was still one more thing she didn't know. Something that would completely change the way she looked at the entire relationship. Because while she was trying to save what they had, Ethan had been having conversations with someone from his past, someone Emily thought was no longer part of his life, his ex-girlfriend. When my boyfriend told me that Ethan had been talking to his ex-girlfriend, I honestly thought that would be the thing that finally made Emily leave, because from the outside, it seemed obvious. She had already forgiven him once and accepted things that hurt her. She had already spent months trying to convince herself that every problem had a solution. But this time felt different. It was about the fact that Ethan had been doing exactly what he always accused her of doing, keeping things from him, not being honest, creating distance. The conversation with his ex happened while Emily was still in Dublin. Her name was Chloe. They had dated years before Emily and Ethan got together. According to Ethan, it was completely over. When Emily told me she was going to leave her university in Dublin for a while, I didn't immediately understand how far that decision would go. At first, it sounded temporary. A pause, a break, something she could reverse later. But it wasn't that simple. She said she was going to move closer to Ethan, that the distance was becoming too hard, that she couldn't keep flying back and forth emotionally between "I miss you" and "I don't trust what's happening when I'm not there." And slowly, her decisions started stacking up. She withdrew from classes. She told herself she would return after things stabilized with Ethan. She told herself it was just a year lost, not a life direction changed. But what she didn't fully admit out loud was that she was building her entire world around him. Ethan didn't push her to quit, not directly. He never said, "Leave your education for me." He didn't have to. Every argument about distance ended the same way. Her feeling guilty for being away, him saying he felt abandoned, and her trying to fix it. So she came back to Manchester, back into her parents' house, and that's where everything tightened. Her father didn't take it well at all. When he found out she had left her studies in Dublin, especially after the family had paid for part of it wasn't just disappointment. It was anger that kept building every day. He became stricter than before, controlling in a way that wasn't just emotional, but structural. "You threw away education for what?" he said one evening. "For a boy?" Emily didn't answer, because anything she said would make it worse. Her father started setting rules again like she was a teenager, not an adult. Curfews returned. Questions about where she was going, who she was meeting, why she was out late. And then he said something that changed the atmosphere in the house completely. "Until you are not married, you live under my rules. You made your choice. Now I make mine." And in that pressure, in that confinement, Ethan became both her escape and her justification. But the relationship between them wasn't stable either. It was already cracked. Distance had turned into dependency. Love had started to feel like negotiation. And then Emily pushed for marriage as a demand. Ethan wasn't ready. He said it directly. He said they were too young, too unstable, too emotionally reactive. He said marriage wouldn't fix everything. But Emily wasn't really asking. She was trying to anchor him, to make sure he couldn't leave, to make sure her father couldn't say she was temporary in someone else's life. The arguments lasted for days, then a week, then another. It became repetitive. The same fight, different night. Ethan saying no, Emily saying, "Then what are we doing?" Ethan trying to slow things down, Emily interpreting that as rejection. Until finally, exhaustion won. They went to the registry office with the cheapest rings they could find because neither of them had financial independence. Ethan never worked. He got money from his mother. Emily was financially tied to her parents. The rings were thin, almost symbolic in their cheapness. Nothing like the images she had once saved in her phone. And when they signed the papers, it didn't feel like celebration, but she posted this on Instagram as some achievement. Booty hardest part wasn't getting married. It was telling her father, because she knows that her father will never let her leave.